Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nithi Robinson.
Hey, how's it going?
And today we're joined by Kelly Shortridge. Kelly, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really excited to chat with you. I've been following your work and citing your articles. I think I even cited it in a book I wrote recently. But citing your articles and like your podcasts that you've been on, things like that for quite a while. But for folks that don't know you or haven't come across any of your hot takes, who is Kelly Shortridge and what are you up to in this industry?
Yes, so I am a senior principal at Fastly in the office of the CTO. I'm thinking about the future of security, which Fastly cares a lot about. In my spare time, like you said, I love writing hot takes, and I like to think of myself as a temporarily disgraced philosopher that's applying my hopeful superpowers to the cybersecurity domain.
Awesome. Yeah, like I said, we're really excited to chat with you. One of the main reasons we brought you on is you just had a book come out called focusing on security chaos engineering. So for folks that haven't checked it out or read it, Nithi and I both have a copy, and I really recommend it to folks to check it out. But, what made you write this book? And then for folks that aren't familiar with the term or concept, what is security chaos engineering?
Yeah, so what made me write the book was, there's a term the kids use called being care mad, which is like you care so much that you're just like mad about it. And I feel like that was a big part of it. Obviously, you mentioned like all my blog posts. I think if you connect the dots over the years between that and some of my talks, I was very frustrated with kind of the status quo in security and seeing that we weren't drawing on all these just like this wellspring of lessons from other domains, whether that's healthcare, air transportation, urban water systems, like you name it. And so the book to me was really a chance, to be honest, glomming onto the hype behind security chaos engineering as a term to really just talk about software resilience and what that means, because that is really what it's a love letter to. And what I wanted to convey is like, look, we can actually approach the problem in a different way, a way that's informed, again, by lessons in other industries. So let's give it a try. And so I tried to make it a very complete summary of like, okay, here are the principles, and then here's what you can do at kind of each stage of the software delivery lifecycle to change things. So what is security chaos engineering? I define it as a socio-technical transformation that enables the organizational ability to gracefully respond to failure and then adapt to evolving conditions. So in that, what's really important is this notion that we have to change. In fact, to nerd out a little bit, one of the foundations of life is the ability to change to stay the same. And I think that's really beautiful. Drawing from biology, that's really what we want. And what we hear about is like, we can't keep up with attackers. It's like, well, we're not changing, so it's really no surprise. So again, this is, I think, really one of the takeaways I would love for your audience is it's all about adapting and changing.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And it honestly aligns with the concept of being resilient is adapting and evolving to the landscape, basically. And one thing you brought up that jumped out to me is how many parallels and how many concepts you pulled from other domains. As I'm reading through the book, you're diving into all these different things and citing these other, domains of expertise or, things that we do as a society. And pointing out how security can learn so much from them. And I've seen a lot of that, when we look at like software supply chain security, which I know you have some interesting perspectives on, and also like vulnerability management and just different things that we do. Why is it that you think, when we come to cybersecurity, we want to recreate everything from scratch rather than look to other domains to take, examples that we can learn from?
That's a great question. And also I'll say that one thing I forgot to mention with the book is that again, I kind of glommed on to the security chaos engineering hype, but really, if I could define kind of what we're talking about, it would just be software resilience. So I'm with you, like really the foundation is resilience. So why don't we look at other domains? I've thought about that a lot because it's very confusing. In some case, I feel like my job is easy because I'm just pattern matching from these other domains. I think part of it is we don't know. A lot of people came up through maybe a computer science background, sometimes not, but a lot of times they were working with like network appliances. Maybe they came up through a SOC. They don't necessarily have an interdisciplinary background, which isn't their fault. It just means maybe they're not exposed to these things. I think it's also wanting to feel like cybersecurity is a really special, new, hot thing. I get that a lot, is that, it's unprecedented and there's absolutely no way that, anything could possibly apply because it's so different. It's like, it's not really. Like, some of the technology is certainly different, but a lot of the fundamentals aren't. And I would even say you don't see us drawing very much from just software engineering. There's a lot of really rich kind of discourse and research in the domain of software quality that we don't draw on, even though it would benefit security, which you can see that I've drawn on in the book. I think some of that, I have a lot of hot takes about that. It could be anything from a bit of jealousy because the software people tend to get more attention, money, budget, etc. I think a lot of it, though, is that, again, that kind of heritage that, we were focused on the network. It was this perimeter strategy for a long time. We're not really software people as an industry. So I could go on at length about, I think also we very much want cybersecurity to feel like a hard science with lots of math and other things. And it's like, well, a lot of it is a soft science because, again, it's a socio-technical system. We need to be thinking about things like economics and psychology, and that stuff matters even if it's not using, physics level math, right?
It's so interesting to me. It's one of the reasons why I got so interested in like human factors and psychology and bringing that into security, because I felt very much the same way. It was like there's all these known concepts, known phenomenon that we experience, and we don't talk about it in security, even though it potentially impacts risk management and a lot of the activities that we do. So I think it's really interesting talking about how we can really leverage a lot of the great stuff that's out there and potentially in different domains or in even industries. I wanted to talk about, because you had this section in your book where you talk about, what is a modern security program, right? And we've had this conversation with other guests too about how even in the last 2 years, but especially the last 5 to 10 years, security has changed so much. Can you talk a little bit about what a modern security program looks like compared to something even 2 to 5 years ago?
Oh yeah, well, I think everyone's aware of the shift from like that perimeter focus, right? I think that's a big part of it. I think another key difference is not thinking in terms of components. That's obviously something I talk a lot about in the book. It's starting to think in terms of systems, seeing the boundaries between like teams you have internally, seeing the boundaries between the human interacting with whatever it is, rather than, as a classic example with like, some sort of injection attack. It's like maybe your web app is secure for whatever that means, and your database is secure again for whatever that means, but it's the interaction between the two that maybe isn't. And I feel like a modern security program really appreciates that. It also has a very different skill set. So again, it's not so much about configuring the blinky boxes and whatever else. It's a lot more about how do we enable people to do the secure thing while still maintaining their productivity. It's very much not that like thou shalt not sort of vibe. That is not what modern security aims for. So I think it's a different blend of skills. It's a different blend of underlying principles. It's much more like how do we be an enabler and an advisor rather than a gatekeeper and, a rule enforcer. And it also, again, with the skill set, I'm very much seeing and believe that security should shift towards the platform engineering model, where basically we identify things that are basically user problems and we solve them with software. And so in that sort of model, again, you're not prescribing really training or policies. You're actually building tools and frameworks that teams will use to pave the road. So again, they can make more ideally secure decisions. But in a lot of cases, like I'll bring up like Netflix, and I think actually Square just came out with another example where it's like a lot of times building these sort of secure paved roads, developers actually increase efficiency, which is beautiful. There are opportunities to like help productivity while making things more secure, because it turns out developers don't have to worry about security anyway. So you're saving them time.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I'm actually a big fan of the platform engineering movement that we're seeing. In my space, in the federal, federal civilian agencies and Department of Defense, they call them software factories, but it's the same concept. It's these cloud-native platforms that are underlied by containers and Kubernetes and things like that, and are building in like secure, hardened containers, infrastructure as code, these guardrails, so that people can, develop and focus on their application and not worry about everything, beneath that essentially. But, I also see there's still a strong culture of clinging to like, we want to control everything. We want to say how everything must be done. And honestly, one thing I've run into quite a bit, and I'm going off script a little bit with some things I wanted to ask you, but since you brought this up, I see in security, we often, try to advocate for how things must be done, but our way of doing things hasn't really kept pace with technology, the way developers work, the way we're consuming and using software. How does security continue to evolve so that the things that we advise and recommend are actually aligned with like the reality of how people are actually working these days?
Oh yeah, so this is a tricky one. I don't know if you've ever run into a problem where it's like something that's kind of natural to you that clearly isn't natural to other people, and it's a little confusing, like how to prescribe change. Because to me, I am so interested in what's new and emerging. Sometimes I see something that's being hyped, and I'm like, okay, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's say, I apologize with my kitty cat wants to be the star of the show. Like unikernels, I'm like, that's cool and it's interesting, but like, is it actually viable in an organization? Maybe not. So I feel like there's that natural curiosity there, which in theory, our industry prides itself on curiosity, but I don't always see that with new technology. The short answer is I'm not really sure outside of writing a book, which I did, like how to encourage people to start looking at this new technology. I do have some talks in the works that kind of double down on some of the stuff I wrote about in the book about how security teams can benefit from some of this new technology, because I think that's part of the problem. A lot of times security teams, I think, hear about newfangled tech, whether it's like containers or infrastructure as code. They seem to think APIs are new. I still don't know how to square that one. And they view it as like, oh, it's more work for us because it's more stuff to secure. Like I've seen like 1,000 microservices versus one monolith. It's 1,000 times the work. It's like, no, it's not. That's not how it works. But I think instead, if we frame it as like, actually, there are a lot of benefits. Like I've talked to CISOs where they talk about serverless environments, being able to deploy to those means that their development teams don't actually have to worry about a bunch of different concerns. They totally greenlight it. It's like, well, yeah, you're deploying your code into this very like hardened and generally sandboxed environment. So I think there's certainly some security teams that get it, that this newfangled stuff can help them, and they're really curious about learning about it. But I think, frankly, there's a lot of self-selection in security where if you have that kind of like more amygdala active, fear-oriented mindset and threat-oriented mindset, then when you see new stuff, all you see is threats rather than opportunities. I don't really know how to fix that on a wide scale other than encouraging more people from outside of security to join in the quest.
Yeah, you said a lot of things that really hit home for me there. You talked about the kind of the emerging technology and remaining curious. And I feel like our field changes so much that you have to stay that way, because if not, you're going to get left behind. You won't keep up with the technologies that are being used, the way of working that's being used, and you're kind of become irrelevant. And we see security like drag our feet when it comes to new technologies. I saw it with cloud. Kubernetes containers. Now we're seeing it with AI, for example. And the thing is like, if you don't go along on the journey, the business is going with or without you. So yes, you better follow them along, because all that's going to happen is you're going to find out, oh, they've already been using this for 8 months. They just didn't come to us because they hate engaging with us, and we say no to everything they ask. So now we have to try to bolt security on, as we often hear, because they just hate engaging with us. We've created these silos due to our behavior. So one thing I wanted to ask you too is like, when we talk about introducing security chaos engineering, it comes across as a disruptive concept for many folks.
Yes.
And in my industry, like people are afraid to disrupt a federal system or a defense system and so on. And I'm sure you run into that on the commercial side as well. How do you help people in the security profession advocate and get buy-in from their leadership to introduce something that could be scary and disruptive? I'm curious your perspective there.
Yeah. So for one, don't call it chaos if you don't want to. Like, I'm like one of the security chaos engineering people. Like, don't worry about that. Just say I'm one of the software resilience people. That'll make me happier anyway. I've actually told some of the pioneers to their face that I don't like that it was called chaos. It does make sense to get hype from developers because chaos sounds really cool to them. To most other people in the business community, it doesn't sound so great, even though I will mention like financial services has, really adopted things like chaos experimentation. But that aside, call it software resilience. Resilience is something that I feel like businesses are like, okay, yes, we want that. Speaking of resilience, is adapting to my cat walking across the screen. So yeah, use the term resilience for one. That's just on a basis, ground kind of truth. So what I would say after that, and one thing I really tried to highlight in the book, is there are a lot of opportunities to combine forces with, whether that's your IT team, CIO, CTO. There are a lot of things that overlap where right now we don't always do a good job collaborating with those teams, or like colluding to figure out how to get buy-in from the upper echelons. And so I think let's give a classic example of something like integration tests, right? A lot of companies don't have integration tests, and then security teams wonder, well, why aren't you integrating like our security testing? It's like they don't even have something that would benefit them, right? And integration tests can really help with security as well. So it's like, start there, start combining forces to like ask about getting integration tests set up, like help them get some wins too. And that can be really powerful. I would especially say, like, if you have a track record of disrupting productivity, then I think you really want to emphasize that, no, like, we're thinking about this approach that is very sensitive to productivity. It's explicitly thinking about kind of the opportunity costs of what security does, that just because we make something more secure, if it's disrupting our ability to like go to market, ship things quickly, like, we're not going to do it. Or if we do it, it's for a really damn good reason, right? So I think there are a bunch of things to think about. I think ultimately it's like, you want to speak their language. We shouldn't expect people to be able to speak our like cyber jargon. And we have to always be sensitive to like, what are the overarching business goals and how do we fit into that?
You said so many things that align with the way I think and have been advocating. Like, first off is like naming things can be problematic. Like if you look at, like you said, don't use the term chaos, for example. It may be scary for some folks. If you look at the term zero trust, that has kind of instilled the wrong perspective of how we think about, zero trust, or just evolving how we do security, basically, to, the lack of implicit trust. Another thing you said that jumped out to me is, you kind of talk about introducing the disruption and chaos. I've always tried to advocate that we should do this ahead of time before like a real incident versus, we historically, as you said, you talk about a lot of compliance and security theater, and we do tabletops and hypothetical walkthroughs of what the system will do in this scenario. But until it actually happens, you have no guarantee of how it will respond under those circumstances. And then ultimately, like you talked about in security, like we always perceive risk only oriented around cybersecurity. There's other risks that the business is concerned about, whether, market share, revenue, delivering on the mission, having stakeholders who are satisfied, customers who are satisfied. We only think about our perspective rather than the broader perspective that the business has to address.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And like I joke in the book, like there's no such thing as like a healthy memory corruption. That's not a thing. There's so many overlaps between performance failures and security failures, or just a developer making a mistake. And that's something an attacker might do purposefully. And so when we start to think about, like you said, like, okay, one, how do we conduct resilience stress tests? That's my friendlier name that maybe your executives have heard from like financial services land. So if we conduct resilience stress tests, we can understand like how that failure looks in our system so we can better prepare for it. But even so, like we can design to reduce some of those hazards by using things like isolation or sandboxing and figuring out other approaches to contain impact regardless of what the failure is. So I'm totally with you. Like we need to be thinking more about the overlaps of failure and where, again, we can be helping out and combining forces better.
It's interesting. I wanted to touch back on what you mentioned about, the fact that we can't actually get a lot of this real testing, right? Like we actually want to do this real testing. And I was reminded of one of the first things I did in like IT infrastructure as a sysadmin. We spent months convincing executive leadership that we wanted to run a real test to bring all the systems down and bring it back online. And they were like, cool, you can do it Saturday and Sunday. And we were like, okay, great. Like we just want to bring everything down and bring it back up. But it took so much convincing because they were like, we can't have downtime. It's like, that's cool. We'll come in Saturday morning. We don't care. We just want to make sure these systems are going to come back online or that we have some resiliency built in. I wanted to talk about, you touched on this a little bit, but about how chaos engineering is really about resiliency, building resilience into application environments and into, I think about it as infrastructure too. But when they hear chaos, they think chaos or like disorder or something like that. But it's actually this really hypothesis scientific based approach, which is one of my favorite things about it. When I was looking into like the framework of chaos engineering, it was like, oh, this is very scientific. It's really using the scientific method. So can you talk a little bit about the hypothesis based approach and how that integrates into security chaos engineering?
Yeah, definitely. Whether you call it chaos experimentation or resilience stress tests, it really is applying the scientific method to security. You're absolutely right. It's okay. We have a hypothesis. I love to say, think about your like, this will always be true assumptions. Like, we'll always detect if there's a new misconfigured port. Like, is that always true? Probably we need to conduct an experiment, right? But it is about collecting evidence. That in itself can be scary. So a lot of security people don't like me because I say we should get empirical. And it turns out they're kind of scared of that because they know that maybe they're not doing as good of a job as they hope or have told people that they're doing. So that in itself can be scary. yeah, it's definitely as much as possible. And you can start small. I definitely don't recommend starting in production. That is terrifying to a lot of people. The good news is that with the rise of some of the new technologies we talked about, infrastructure as code, and certainly cloud computing, serverless, you can recreate at least decent fidelity, kind of like staging environments, or I like to put it as like experimentation environments, if you want, where you can be conducting these experiments so you're not causing downtime. Obviously, the whole point of the experiment is actually that you fix things so you aren't causing more downtime. Yeah, I would definitely say like start small. It's very much like if you were starting to do science, let's say in your backyard, you wouldn't start with like, well, let's see like how the like fungal networks interact among all my trees in the backyard. It's like, no, you're probably going to start with like, I don't know, an acorn under a microscope or something, right? You want to do the same thing with these experiments. Start small, something that, again, you are pretty sure is like an always true sort of thing, and verify it with experimental evidence, and make sure to document and circulate that evidence, and then retry the experiment. Automate it if you can, so you have this kind of like continuous experimentation capability. Because as we've talked about, like things are changing all the time. You never know what will actually disrupt that assumption. And then from there, once you build that kind of muscle memory, once your organization gets more comfortable with the idea that we are conducting these scientific experiments to verify our security assumptions, you can start to tap other teams, other systems, like expand kind of your experimental purview. But as we talked about, like we're talking about socio-technical systems, the hardest part of chaos experimentation is not actually conducting the experiments. It's getting the buy-in, like you said. It's making sure people feel confident and comfortable and are learning from the experiments.
Well, and that to me really speaks about the iterative process, right? Like we talk about Kanban in security as far as like vulnerability management, secure configuration, but we don't talk a lot about Kanban when it comes to resiliency, right? Like continuously testing that resiliency and making sure that the systems are acting the same way today as they should be tomorrow and the next day and the next day after. But with so much change happening, especially in our development environments, it's something that really needs to be tested continuously because things are going to be different day to day, especially when you're working on whether it's a 2-week sprint or a 1-week sprint, whatever it might be, whatever your cycle is, things are going to be changing rapidly. And if we're not consistently testing or testing over time, and even adapting those experiments over time, it's going to be hard to sort of get a good picture of what's actually going on in the environment.
Oh, yeah. And I think a lot of security teams try to cope today. This is the like very inefficient status quo, is they just try to slow down the change, right? They try to like manually review every single change, and like they're 6 months behind, sometimes more, and that just doesn't scale, right? And this capability definitely helps them scale that kind of like sense of control and understanding much better.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in terms of the dragging of the feet and trying to control everything. And then, it's kind of, it runs counterintuitive to what we hear with, security must be a business enabler. It's like that activity, that kind of behavior is not enabling the business at all, or relationships with your peers. So I wanted to ask you too, I've cited your work, like I said, several times. I think one of the first works I came across of yours was the markets don't give a, what about security basically. And you dove into data about how organizations, we hear a lot about reputational brand and damage and market consequences and all these things, and you dove into that. The data doesn't prove that out. And, I've noticed that, there's a lot of that when we talk about, you mentioned the term empirical, when we dive into the data of how we do things, in security, whether it's vulnerability management or, trying to communicate risk to the business, things like that, the data doesn't support a lot of what we try to advocate. So I'm curious, what made you start taking this kind of counterculture approach, or because some people I'm sure get offended when you
you have no idea.
Your perspective basically pushes against their sense of reality or what they think is true, even if the data doesn't support it. So I'm curious how, folks have responded to you, writing these kind of pieces. I personally,
oh my God, they've responded very poorly in a lot of cases. I know after that post, I think I know that post was like escalated and manually reviewed in multiple organizations, like to remove it from Slack. They were so mad. I know my blog's been banned in at least one place. Like it's like really bad. People like really don't like it. I think they view it as, I don't know if it's misinformation, but very like data informed. I don't know. I think you're right. Like I have this almost like pathological obsession with trying to get to like the truth of things. I like to joke it's like very Nietzschean, which by the way, it did not win him many friends to be that like kind of truth seeker and calling out like, hey, so we're kind of like basing a lot of our life on delusions, right? So I kind of feel like I don't know. I put in my last blog post, the latest one on the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. I don't actually know how to sell out. I would probably be on a beach island somewhere, like Island Beach, if I knew how to sell out. It's just, I very much view it as like, so I will say some people have sometimes slandered me saying that like, oh, you don't care about security. That is not true. I would not be like putting this much effort into all of this writing and thinking about it if I didn't care. I care a lot. I think it's incredibly important. And that's why I feel like we can't, keep messing around and doing all this performative work. Like, let's start to get empirical. Let's get outcome driven. And I see so many well-meaning people, whether that's site reliability engineers or infrastructure engineers or your typical kind of programmer and developer, they do care about security. They just hear like mountains of BS. And they're like, how do I sift through this to figure out what I should actually be doing in a way that's not going to get me fired because my job is to deliver code, right? And so I've been trying to find basically like, okay, what are the ways that we can help those people like actually focus on the security problem? How do we bring, the rest of security out of the dark ages to start to make things better? But it turns out a lot of people, it's ultimately fear. So there was one person who I'll keep anonymous who was very helpful in telling me like, listen, the stuff you say scares me because I think I'm going to be obsolete. And they were very honest and self-aware about that. And I appreciated it because a lot of what I do talk about, like, yeah, maybe the future I'm talking about doesn't align with your skill sets. You can learn though. I fundamentally believe everyone in security can learn. I have an economics background. I did not major in computer science. Like, I am entirely self-taught programming, self-taught security. I started my career as an investment banker. If I can do it, I promise everyone else can do it. And you don't even have to learn that much in software. There are a lot of, if you know Excel, you're going to get Python, right? And that's at least enough to start to have some empathy for developers, even if you have a blog, like set up CI/CD for it. Like, that's what I've done. And it's great to just, again, kind of empathize with a lot of those processes. But this is kind of a long diatribe in saying like, if you're mad, don't be mad and bitter, like get good, right? Like, you can level up, believe in yourself, like you're capable of a lot. So don't try to like drag everyone else down with you just because you want to stick to the same strategies you already know. That's my take.
Yeah,
yes, people get very mad.
I think it is really interesting, right? Because we talk a lot about, security is everybody's job, right? And if it's everybody's job, then you wouldn't necessarily need, right, in the future somewhere, these massive security teams.
Right.
But the idea is that I think a lot of our skill sets in, whether you're a security architect or an engineer or you work with developers, a lot of those skills translate to data science, to development, to, network infrastructure, cloud, like whatever it might be. And so I think people, right, it's not just about having security knowledge and expertise, but it's really about understanding the entire environment, right? Whether that's the business, whether that's the actual development environment, whatever it might be, right? Risk management to me is the whole picture.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it's an interesting point to make, to say that, it's not necessarily that you'll be obsolete. It's just that we need to change our skills and adapt, just as, technology and development environments adapt.
Yeah. And I think you see this with, sysadmins were very like click ops, and now we have DevOps and they're using automation. And the ones who didn't do that maybe could find jobs at, some of the more like mature, let's say, legacy sort of organizations, but eventually they do have to adapt to the modern technology. It's not like security is the only one doing this. Database administration, I cited in the book, you don't really hear about DBAs anymore, right? But they also adapted. They got more embedded in software engineering teams. So my hot take is like, maybe we don't need like security teams. It doesn't mean security people go away. It just means it looks different. I know, Nikki, like you do incident response sort of stuff. Maybe it's just that your role changes to like incidents or incidents, and you respond to failure of the performance and the security kind, right? I don't think that would be a huge leap for you, right? A lot of it is just understanding how the system works so you can recover it quickly. So I like to think it's a very hopeful message. But again, a lot of people view it as like, you're telling me like I don't deserve to have a job, which is not the case. You don't deserve to have a job. All you're going to do is like drag the organization down and be bitter about it, right? If you're curious though, and you have this spirit of learning and collaborating, then I think you're going to be fine.
Yeah, I mean, really what you said, it resonates with me. And it goes back to what you all mentioned in the beginning about the psychological aspect is like people are so fixated on ego and being right versus winning. You know, like for me, like I don't give a shit about being right. I want to get better and win. And if that means I need to evolve or learn something new, great. Like insecurity, like we have, as you all know, we're all resource strapped when it comes to people, time, and energy and attention. Like if there's a better way to do it and the data proves what we're doing is inefficient, I want to know that because I want to do better. Like I don't want to just hide and bury my head in the sand and pretend that like, you know, that I don't want to see that. It's like I want to know it so that we can win, do better, and deliver better outcome for the organization. And I think people need to have that perspective. Sorry, I'm laughing because someone mentioned your Verizon data breach.
Yes.
So yeah, I think you know I'm more interested in evolving and winning, and you know if there's a better way of doing it or growing or being more effective, I want to know. I don't want to hide from that. And I think people need to take that perspective too. So another topic I wanted to ask you real quick before we wrap things up here is you wrote an article. I think I want to say with Josiah, and I may say his name wrong, Dirkstra. I may have his last name wrong, but you guys wrote an article, I think, about driving down, you know, kind of the ROI, right, for security, you know, malicious actors and attackers. And I think that's really pertinent now, as you saw with the data breach investigation report. You know, 95% of it's all financially driven. So if you can, you know, exhaust their resources or make it more costly or less efficient or drive down their ROI, that's a major win. What made you guys, you know, touch on that topic and dive into that? And I'll share the article in the comments for folks who want to check it out too.
My cat unplugged my mic. I apologize.
It happens.
Speaking of chaos, yeah. So yeah, with ROI, I think it's interesting. Yeah, a lot of people don't think about attacks or attackers as operating.
Oh wait, did we lose sound?
Yeah, you're on mute. I think the cat hit your audio.
That's all right. It's better than when my dog unplugged the entire computer. So
I think her cat read the book and he's trying to introduce some disruption.
yes, he's doing some testing.
How about now?
You're
Yes.
good. Yep, you're good.
Great. He looks very satisfied with himself for what it's worth. So good job, Kitty. Yeah. So in terms of ROI, yeah, thinking about attacks like it's a business. I saw somewhere, I forget who said it, but it's kind of like having, it's almost like a technology startup, but with the financial infrastructure of like an ice cream stand, which I find very amusing because obviously they don't have access to financial infrastructure like legitimate businesses. Yeah, people have, the attackers have, you know, revenue goals, they have profitability goals. I think there were some Wired articles. Oh my God, you are not unplugging this again, little man. There we go. Right. Revenue goals, profitability goals. There were some articles, I think, in Wired where it showed, you know, they were investing their profits back into like improving their infrastructure operations. You know, they use automation and scripting. In fact, I would argue that
I think we lost audio again.
He got you. The cat got you.
She
wow.
There you
wow.
go.
The
You're back.
number. Okay, is this good? We'll switch into these. Okay, great. He can't unplug these, so that's the good news. So yeah, so the attackers were investing back their profits into like improving infrastructure. So a lot of times I always say that attackers, your typical attacker looks more like an SRE rather than a security person. You know, they're scripting, they're doing automation, they're you know, doing observability to make sure that their operations are being caught, and certainly looking to see like what's their success. So to poison their ROI, you just have to think about, okay, what's going to basically hinder their time to market, what's going to hinder their ability to succeed in their outcome, which is usually gaining access to something. How do we slow them down? How do we add friction? So the paper you referenced, which is about sludge, which is a concept from behavioral economics. The sludge is like when you subscribe to something and like a newspaper in my hometown, and it's very easy to click a button to subscribe, and then you have to like call them up and sit on hold forever to unsubscribe. That's sludge. It's like unnecessary friction. So what if we add that unnecessary friction to what attackers do, right? We can slow down and throttle their network connections. you know, I'm really passionate about like deception. So like, can we funnel them into this like shadowy deception environment where they just waste a ton of time compromising that while we're observing them and kind of like pointing and laughing? I also think it's just a lot of fun knowing that you're kind of like ruining attackers' days. I think that's almost like a healthy coping mechanism for it. So I think there's a lot we can do. And I really wish that that was more of an underpinning of security strategy, which is how do we poison that ROI? Because once you start to think through that lens, you start to see a lot of commonalities with what we want, regardless of kind of like the attack or even the attacker, right? Nation states will try kind of like the easier things if they can because they don't want to deploy like more expensive things like ODA. So it helps you kind of see like, okay, what are all the ways that we can, again, like poison the ROI? The cat is an insider threat. That's, you know, I often think insider threats are overhyped, but this is maybe disproving my point. Yeah, so with ROI, I think the key thing to think about is just like, you can actually, by the way, tap your developers and software engineering teams for this because they'll think kind of like an attacker in this sense, where it's like, again, you want to deploy code, it's going to run with your end users, you know, it's going to perform remote operations. So ask them like, okay, what would ruin your day, right? What would make it feel really terrible for you? And I think from there, you can start to develop a lot of interesting strategies, which often are less expensive than, you know, your bolt-on or blinky box and stuff like that. So ironically, it can provide a better ROI while you're ruining attackers' ROI. But the paper was great. Loved collaborating with Josiah. He's brilliant. And we talk about a ton of strategies that can help kind of like ruin attackers' days and like introduce this sludge.
Yeah, it's such a cool concept, and I think really interesting to especially for me, it's like something that like I hadn't even thought about or hadn't really looked into, so it's like very great to look at. Well, I wanted to before we have listen, the cat seems very smart. I have a cat. I know that they can interact and pull things out. So before I take us out, I wanted to ask, we know that you have the book that just came out, the Security Chaos Engineering book that just came out. But is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Any projects you have going on that you wanted to share?
Oh man, I feel like I already always have like 50 million projects going on at the same time. Sometimes I have a hard time narrowing it down. So to be honest, if I had thought about this ahead of time, I would have come with a list to ask the audience, like, okay, what should I prioritize? By the way, I do want to make my joke about the cat where it's the advanced persistent threat. Haha. I love that.
Oh, that's
joke.
pretty good. That's pretty
Thank
good.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I'm working on in my spare time. No, I'm a hermit that just loves reading and writing. I think one thing that actually, speaking to the audience, if you read the book and there's anything you either found confusing or you're like, actually, I really want to get my executives on board or want more of the like, you know, TLDR version, I am thinking about kind of like a suite of either blog posts or like PDFs where it's just like, okay, here's like one of the concepts and let's lay it out in a more digestible, almost like infographic-y way. So I'd love feedback on that. I always have like a ton of spicy posts queued. Honestly, a lot of what I'm focusing on right now is like the fiction novel I'm writing as a break from the other novel or the nonfiction book. So yeah, I will mention that Fastly's working on some really cool stuff. They actually, I don't think know that I'm doing this podcast, so this is a little rogue and yellow, but I will say for people that are looking to do things like secure by design and resilience, working with people or companies that are providing the underlying infrastructure and thinking about how to weave security into that is a really fulfilling place to work. This cat. So fun fact, I feed my cats at 9 a.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Eastern, and guess what we're approaching right now?
Yep.
Yeah. He's trying to hold my technology ransom, huh? So I don't know. I guess that's a really long, rambling answer to say I'm working on a million things all the time. If people have ideas where you're like, listen, I have heard this like BS myth over and over. Can you please just give like your typical like Shortridge just like slander about it? Like I would be happy to. I actually don't get a lot of feedback of that kind of just like, hey, like love this. Like, can you expand on this or talk about this? So yeah, hit me up. Just leave posts anywhere on LinkedIn. I'll see them and get inspired. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Definitely. Yeah. Awesome. And I think Chris and I can relate to having, maybe 4, 5, 7, 10 things going on at once. No, I wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us today, talking about security, chaos engineering, resilience, testing, everything in between. I know I really enjoyed the book. I highly recommend anyone to check it out. And for me, it's got a lot of concepts that are not, it's not just security chaos engineering. There's a lot that you can work to build into, like we were talking about, a modern security program, but thinking about things differently. So I really enjoyed the book. Thanks again for joining us. That's going to take us out
Thank
for
you for
this week.
having me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And we'll see everybody next week. All right. Thanks.